Foreword of From the Deep Woods to Civilization, Chapters in the Autobiography of an Indian by Charles A. Eastman, Ohiyesa. From the Deep Woods to Civilization, Chapters in the Autobiography of an Indian by Charles A. Eastman, Ohiyesa. Foreword. Indian Boyhood, published first in 1902 and in many subsequent editions, pictures the first of the three distinct periods in the life of the writer of this book. His childhood and youth were a part of the free wilderness life of the first American, a life that is gone forever. By dint of much persuasion, the story has now been carried on from the point of that plunge into the unknown with which the first book ends, a change so abrupt and so overwhelming that the boy of 15 felt as if he were dead and traveling to the spirit land. We are now to hear of a single-hearted quest throughout 18 years of adolescence and early maturity for the attainment of the modern ideal of Christian culture, and again of a quarter of a century devoted to testing that hard-won standard in various fields of endeavor, partly by holding it up before his own race and partly by interpreting their racial ideals to the white man, leading in the end to a partial reaction in favor of the earlier, the simpler, perhaps the more spiritual philosophy. It is clearly impossible to tell the whole story, but much that cannot be told may be read between the lines. The broad outlines, the salient features of an uncommon experience are here set forth in the hope that they may strengthen for some readers the conception of our common humanity. E.G.E. End of foreword. Chapter 1 of From the Deep Woods to Civilization by Charles A. Eastman, Ohiyesa. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. The Way Opens. One can never be sure of what a day may bring to pass. At the age of 15 years, the deepening current of my life swung upon such a pivotal day, and in the twinkling of an eye its whole course was utterly changed, as if a little mountain brook should pause and turn upon itself to gather strength for the long journey toward an unknown ocean. From childhood I was consciously trained to be a man. That was, after all, the basic thing. But after this I was trained to be a warrior and a hunter, and not to care for money or possessions, but to be in the broadest sense a public servant. After arriving at a reverent sense of the pervading presence of the Spirit and Giver of life, and a deep consciousness of the brotherhood of man, the first thing for me to accomplish was to adapt myself perfectly to natural things. In other words, to harmonize myself with nature. To this end, I was made to build a body both symmetrical and enduring, a house for the soul to live in, a sturdy house, defying the elements. I must have faith and patience. I must learn self-control and be able to maintain silence. I must do with as little as possible and start with nothing most of the time, because a true Indian always shares whatever he may possess. I felt no hatred for our tribal foes. I looked upon them more as the college athlete regards his rivals from another college. There was no thought of destroying a nation, taking away their country, or reducing the people to servitude. For my race rather honored and bestowed gifts upon their enemies at the next peaceful meeting, until they had adopted the usages of the white man's warfare for spoliation and conquest. There was one unfortunate thing about my early training, however. That is, I was taught never to spare a citizen of the United States, although we were on friendly terms with the Canadian white men. The explanation is simple. My people had been turned out of some of the finest country in the world, now forming the great states of Minnesota and Iowa. The Americans pretended to buy the land at 10 cents an acre, but never paid the price. The debt stands unpaid to this day. Because they did not pay, the Sioux protested. Finally came the outbreak of 1862 in Minnesota, when many settlers were killed, and forthwith our people, such as were left alive, were driven by the troops into exile. My father, who was among the fugitives in Canada, had been betrayed by a half-breed across the United States line near what is now the city of Winnipeg. Some of the party were hanged at Fort Snelling near St. Paul. We supposed, and in fact we were informed, that all were hanged. This was why my uncle, in whose family I lived, had taught me never to spare a white man from the United States. During the summer and winter of 1871, the band of Sioux to which I belonged, a clan of the Wahpetons, or dwellers among the leaves, roamed the upper Missouri region and along the Yellowstone River. In that year, I tasted to the full the joy and plenty of wild existence. I saw buffalo, elk, and antelope in herds numbering thousands. The forests teemed with deer, and in the badlands dwelt the bighorns, or Rocky Mountain sheep. At this period, grizzly bears were numerous and were brought into camp quite commonly, like any other game. We frequently met and camped with the Hudson Bay half-breeds in their summer hunt of the buffalo, and we were on terms of friendship with the Assiniboines and the Crees, but in frequent collision with the Blackfeet, the Gros Ventres, and the Crows. However, there were times of truce when all met in peace for a great midsummer festival and exchange of gifts. The Sioux roamed over an area nearly 1,000 miles in extent. In the summer, we gathered together in large numbers, but towards fall, we would divide into small groups or bands and scatter for the trapping and the winter hunt. Most of us hugged the wooded river bottoms. Some depended entirely upon the buffalo for food, while others, and among these my immediate kindred, hunted all kinds of game and trapped and fished as well. Thus, I was trained thoroughly for an all-around outdoor life and for all natural emergencies. I was a good rider and a good shot with the bow and arrow, alert and alive to everything that came within my ken. I had never known, nor ever expected to know, any life but this. In the winter and summer of 1872, we drifted toward the southern part of what is now Manitoba. In this wild, rolling country, I rapidly matured and laid, as I supposed, the foundations of my life career, never dreaming of anything beyond this manful and honest, unhampered existence. My horse and my dog were my closest companions. I regarded them as brothers, and if there was a hereafter, I expected to meet them there. With them, I went out daily into the wilderness to seek inspiration and store up strength for coming manhood. My teachers dreamed no more than I of any change in my prospects. I had now taken part in all our tribal activities except that of war, and was nearly old enough to be initiated into the ritual of the warpath. The world was full of natural rivalry. I was eager for the day. I had attained the age of 15 years and was about to enter into and realize a man's life as we Indians understood it, when the change came. One fine September morning, as I returned from a daily hunt, there seemed to be an unusual stir and excitement as I approached our camp. My faithful grandmother was on the watch and met me to break the news. "Your father has come, he whom we thought dead at the hands of the white men," she said. It was a day of miracle in the deep Canadian wilderness, before the Canadian Pacific had been even dreamed of, while the Indian and the buffalo still held sway over the vast plains of Manitoba, east of the Rocky Mountains. It was, perhaps, because he was my honored father, that I lent my bewildered ear to his eloquent exposition of the so-called civilized life, or the way of the white man. I could not doubt my own father, so mysteriously come back to us, as it were, from the spirit land. Yet there was a voice within saying to me, a false life, a treacherous life. In accordance with my training, I asked few questions, although many arose in my mind. I simply tried silently to fit the new ideas like so many blocks into the pattern of my philosophy, while according to my untutored logic, some did not seem to have straight sides or square corners to fit in with the cardinal principles of eternal justice. My father had been converted by Protestant missionaries, and he gave me a totally new vision of the white man, as a religious man and a kindly. But when he related how he had set apart every seventh day for religious duties and the worship of God, Laying aside every other occupation on that day, I could not forbear exclaiming, "Father, and does he then forget God during the 6 days and do as he pleases?" Our own life, I will admit, is the best in a world of our own, such as we have enjoyed for ages, said my father. But here is a race which has learned to weigh and measure everything, time and labor and the results of labor, and has learned to accumulate and preserve both wealth and the records of experience for future generations. You yourselves know and use some of the wonderful inventions of the white man, such as guns and gunpowder, knives and hatchets, garments of every description, and there are thousands of other things both beautiful and useful. Above all, they have their great teacher, whom they call Jesus, and he taught them to pass out their wisdom and knowledge to all other races. It is true that they have subdued and taught many peoples, and our own must eventually bow to this law. The sooner we accept their mode of life and follow their teaching, the better it will be for us all. I have thought much on this matter, and such is my conclusion. There was a mingling of admiration and indignation in my mind as I listened. My father's 2 brothers were still far from being convinced, but filial duty and affection overweighed all my prejudices. I was bound to go back with him as he desired me to do, and my grandmother and her only daughter accompanied us on this perilous journey. The line between Canada and the United States was closely watched at this time by hostile Indians. Therefore, my father thought it best to make a dash for Devil's Lake in North Dakota, where he could get assistance if necessary. He knew Major Forbes, who was in command of the military post and the agency. Our guide we knew to be an unscrupulous man who could easily betray us for a kettle of whiskey or a pony. One of the first things I observed was my father's reading aloud from a book every morning and evening, followed by a very strange song and a prayer. Although all he said was in Indian, I did not understand it fully. He apparently talked aloud to the Great Mystery, asking for our safe guidance back to his home in the States. The first reading of this book of which I have any recollection was the 23rd Psalm, and the first hymn he sang in my presence was to the old tune of Ortonville. It was his Christian faith and devotion which was perhaps the strongest influence toward my change of heart and complete change of my purpose in life. I think it was at our second encampment that we met a large caravan of Canadian half-breeds accompanied by a band of northern Ojibways. As was usual with the former, they had plenty of whiskey. They were friendly enough with us, at least while sober, but the Indians were not. Father showed them his papers as a United States citizen and a letter from Major Forbes telling of his peaceful mission, but we could not trust our ancestral enemies, the Ojibways, especially when excited with strong drink. My father was calm and diplomatic throughout, but thus privately instructed me. "My son, conceal yourself in the woods, and if the worst comes, you must flee on your swift pony. Before daylight you can pass the deep woods and across the Assiniboine River." He handed me a letter to Major Forbes. I said, "I will try," and as soon as it was dark I hid myself to be in readiness. Meanwhile, my father called the leading half-breeds together and told them again that he was under the protection of his government, also that the Sioux would hold them responsible if anything happened to us. Just then they discovered that another young brave and I were not to be found, which made them think that my father had dispatched us to the nearest military post for help. They immediately led away their drunken comrades and made a big talk to their Ojibway friends so that we remained undisturbed until morning. Some days later, at the south end of Devil's Lake, I left our camp early to shoot some ducks when the morning flight should begin. Suddenly, when out of sight of the others, my eye caught a slight movement in the rank grass. Instinctively, I dropped and flattened myself upon the ground, but soon a quick glance behind me showed plainly the head of a brave hidden behind a bush. I waited, trying to figure out some plan of escape, yet facing the probability that I was already surrounded, until I caught sight of another head almost in front and still another to my left. In the moments that elapsed after I fully realized my situation, I thought of almost everything that had happened to me up to that day, of a remarkable escape from the Ojibways, of the wild pets I had had, and of my playmates in the Canadian camps whom I should never see again. I also thought with more curiosity than fear of the great mystery that I was soon to enter. As these thoughts were passing through my mind, I carelessly moved and showed myself plainly to the enemy. Suddenly, from behind the nearest bush, came the sound of my own Sioux tongue and the words, "Are you a Sioux?" Possibly my countenance may not have changed much, but certainly I grew weak with surprise and relief. As soon as I answered, "Yes," I was surrounded by a group of warriors of my tribe, who chuckled at the joke that had come so near to costing me my life, for one of them explained that he had been on the point of firing when I exposed myself so plainly that he saw I was not an Ojibway in war paint, but probably a Sioux like himself. After a variety of adventures, we arrived at the canvas city of Jamestown, then the terminal point of the Northern Pacific Railroad. I was out watering the ponies when a terrific peal of thunder burst from a spotless blue sky, and indeed seemed to me to be running along the surface of the ground. The terrified ponies instantly stampeded, and I confess I was not far behind them, when a monster with one fiery eye poked his head around a corner of the hill. When we reached camp, my father kindly explained, and I was greatly relieved. It was a peaceful Indian summer day when we reached Flandreau in Dakota Territory, the citizen Indian settlement, and found the whole community gathered together to congratulate and welcome us home. End of chapter 1.